Let's take a look at the British colonial empire and how it developed. So news started spreading around Europe about how Spain had discovered this mystical, magical new world, aka they thought it was India at first, but quickly realized that wasn't the case. Eventually, this new world began to be called Amerigo, and eventually America, etc., etc., etc. News also spread about how Spain was developing more and more land and resources in the New World, and that began to pique the interest of other European populations and other European empires, and that kicked off the British colonial movement. So the British colonial empire started with religiously persecuted groups fleeing England to pursue a better life in this new world, and in parallel to that, the British Empire started forming official settlements in the Caribbean and in North America. Eventually, these settlements turned into what became the 13 colonies. Eventually, the 13 colonies became what is now the United States of America. But before that happened, the 13 colonies rebelled and revolted against their British overlords, right? And all of the British loyalists in the Americas after the Revolution fled to Canada. In parallel with what was happening in the Americas, the British Empire was developing in Australia and in India and in New Zealand. The British Empire had a huge operation in India for producing all sorts of different things. In the late 1800s, the British Empire had a vision for Africa. Their vision was to completely conquer the eastern half of Africa. I apologize if this seems callous. I'm just relaying what happened. And as you can see, the British Empire made progress on their plans with Africa. And in the 1900s, the decolonization psyche/movement overtook the world and the British Empire was dissolved. Yes, you do see that little red dot on the southern tip of Spain. That is the Strait of Gibraltar. That is a strip of land that the British Empire keeps to watch everything that goes in and out of the Mediterranean. Let me also mention about the image that the British have, right? The British Empire has probably the cleanest image of all the European powers, but they have done many things. For example, the Opium War. What is the Opium War? The Opium War was a conflict between China and Britain in the 1800s. And the gist of it was that Britain was producing opium in East India and distributing it into China. China noticed this and over a few decades noticed that their population was getting more and more addicted to opium. It's speculated in the late 1800s and early 1900s that about 10% of China was addicted to British opium. In the late 1800s, or the mid 1800s, I think, China asked Britain, or pretty much they banned British opium from coming in on the ports. And how did the British respond? They opened fire and declared war on China. And that is the origin of why China hates the West. One of the main origins of why China hates America and Britain and the West.